Please take your seats. Sorry if I appear to be shaking slightly. It's because I am. Now, let's look together at Luke chapter 22, verses 47 to 54. It'll help us if you can have that open in front of you so that we can see. So we're going to just look at a few bits of detail that help us to understand what's going on. First of all, I want you to notice what happens in verse 47. While he was still speaking, a crowd came up, and the man who was called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. Luke does this quite often. He connects one story with the next, one scene, if you like, from his account of Jesus' life with the next. And here we have it. While he was still speaking, well, he's been on the Mount of Olives praying with his disciples, except his disciples haven't been praying. They've been sleeping. They're just exhausted with sorrow because of what is happening and is about to happen. Jesus there pouring his heart out to God, saying, if there is any other way, take this cup from me, he says, this cup of wrath, this cup of suffering. We'll come back to what he's talking about in a moment. But he says, if you're willing, take it from me, but not my will, but yours. And the disciples just can't cope. They fall asleep. He goes up to them and says, why are you sleeping? Pray that you will not fall into temptation. And then at that moment, as Jesus is still speaking with his disciples, one of his disciples appears. We sort of haven't noticed that he's missing. But one of the 12 comes leading a crowd. So you have Jesus addressing a crowd, and then you have another crowd. This other crowd, though, looks very different. They're armed to the teeth, carrying clubs and swords, Jesus says in verse 53. And just as Jesus is there leading his disciples through speech, so Judas comes leading this crowd of ruffians. And this collision happens. And it is not what it seems. Because Judas, as he reaches Jesus, steps forward to kiss him. A kiss is just a kiss? No. Not in this moment. This kiss is a betrayal. This kiss is an act of utter evil. This is the moment at which it becomes clear that Judas really has sold his soul for money. The chief priests and the teachers of the law have offered him cash to betray Jesus. And Jesus knows exactly what's going on. Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? In fact, the very act of stepping forward to kiss Jesus like this was an insult in itself, because according to the sort of rabbinic mores of the day, the way you treat a teacher, this isn't what you do. The same kind of thing exists today, for instance, within the Greek Orthodox Church. If you meet a bishop or a senior bishop, an archimandrite in the Greek Orthodox Church, you should never offer them a blessing or offer to pray for them. It's considered very insulting. Instead, the way to show respect is not to offer to bless them, but to ask them to bless you. And so it was with followers and rabbis. You wouldn't greet your rabbi, you would wait for your rabbi to greet you. You wouldn't sort of walk forward with your hand outstretched or lean in to give them a kiss of welcome. You would wait as a mark of respect. But now Judas approaches Jesus and says, with his body language, you're no better than me. We're equals. He betrays him with what looks like a mark of respect, but is actually a mark of disrespect, with what looks like an act of friendship. He stabs Jesus in the back. He seals his fate. He makes his death inevitable. So things aren't what they seem. The man leans in for a kiss, but Jesus shows it for exactly what it is. The second thing that's not as it seems is the whole arrest. And again, Jesus is the one who points out what's really going on. He says, am I leading a rebellion, verse 52, am I leading a rebellion that you've come with swords and clubs? Every day I was with you in the temple courts. You didn't lay a hand on me. But this is your hour, when darkness reigns. Do you see what Jesus is pointing out? Look, you're making this look like an anti-terror operation. You've sent the SWAT team to arrest the man who has been unarmed in your courts every day. You could have arrested me publicly without violence. But you've come and you're treating me like a terrorist. Can you not see what's going on? There's this kind of great irony, isn't there, when he says, this is the hour when darkness reigns. Because it's the middle of the night. It is pitch black. They come with torches so that they can see. It's quite possible that they've asked, Jesus is one of the most publicly recognizable figures around, but it may be that they've asked Judas to identify him because actually it's just so dark. That's why they need the kiss, the greeting. But it's not just that it's night. It's that they're acting in the dark. They fear Jesus, they hate Jesus, they want Jesus dead, but they're not prepared to do it publicly. They could at any moment have just come and led him quietly away when he was preaching in the marketplace or in the temple. But they don't. They do their deeds of evil in the dark. And isn't that just the way? I don't know whether you know this, but the introduction of British summertime, which maybe caught me out, but when it was introduced, what they discovered is it actually reduced the crime rate. Why? Because people like to do their crimes in the dark. And it didn't get dark till later. And so crime actually went down because of the introduction of an extra hour of daylight at the end of the day. People love to do their evil deeds in secret, hidden, almost as if they weren't real. And so you see it in this most evil of deeds, in the betrayal and arrest of the best man who ever lived, as if he were a common criminal. It is a deed of darkness. And that's the point at which we see the third thing that's not really as it seems. Because darkness reigning is a really strange concept, isn't it? Because darkness doesn't actually have any power. If you're in a dark room and you turn on the light, is there any kind of battle between the darkness that was there and the light that is shone? There is none. Light is a positive force. Darkness is just what there is if there is no light. It's not itself anything. It has no power. We'll come back to that in a moment. But you see, what Jesus is revealing in that moment, and what Jesus reveals in an astonishing moment in the middle of this story, is that the real power here is not the men with their clubs and their swords, not Judas with his kiss, not the people giving the orders in Jerusalem in their warm, safe palaces, but Jesus, the light of the world. Darkness has apparent power, but it doesn't have real power. And Jesus reveals in this moment that he is the one in the situation who really has power. If you know the Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe book by C.S. Lewis, there's this astonishing moment where the great lion Aslan, who's a picture of Jesus Christ, is being tied down to the stone table where he's going to be sacrificed by the White Witch. And as he's being tied down, he is being mocked by the creatures that should rightly be terrified of him. His great paws are sort of tied to the slab. A muzzle is put over his enormous mouth full of sharp teeth. And these creatures think they've got him. They think they've beaten him. They think they've won. And my friend's son, when he first read that, when he was just a little lad, he said, "But Daddy, just one swipe of Aslan's paw would destroy all of them." And he was absolutely right. And Jesus shows that here in verse 51. A scuffle breaks out. Jesus' friends decide they're not going to let him go without a fight. They've got 2 swords with them. Jesus has agreed that 2 swords was plenty for them to bring with them. And they pull out their swords and they go at it. And immediately they strike the high priest's servant on his ear, cutting it off. It's a very shocking and bloody moment. I don't know if you've ever imagined what it might be like to see someone have their ear cut off with a sword. But actually, it's not terribly nice, and there's a lot of blood. Any kind of head wound produces a lot of blood. It's a shocking moment where the disciples are like, "It's all right, Jesus, don't worry, we'll look after you." And Jesus goes, "Stop! Enough!" And in that moment, he reveals that he is in control of the whole situation, not just because he can stop his disciples and he can stop the scuffle and just go quietly, but because what he does next, he just heals the man's ear. You see that? Verse 51. Jesus answered no more of this, and he tied the man's ear and healed him. I mean, can you imagine? There's no trauma surgeon in the world who could just do that. Just pick up the guy's ear off the floor and fix it. But such is the power of Jesus that with just a touch, he can restore what is broken. He can heal. And in that moment, you realize, don't you? This man, apparently being led away under armed guard, apparently defeated and beaten, is actually the one who spoke the universe into being. It's a creative miracle, healing the severed ear of a casualty of a sword stroke. He just remakes. This is the God who said, "Let there be light." And there was light. Who flung the sun and the moon and the stars into space. Who has immeasurable power. And over whom darkness has no power. So the very first thing that is recorded is that God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. So what's going on here? Well, Jesus has been wrestling in the garden in prayer. He knows that he has to go and suffer a terrible fate. He talks about this cup that he wants taken from him. Now, in the Old Testament, the cup of God's wrath is this picture of God's judgment on human sin, on God's judgment of our darkness. It talks about how he'll make the nations drink the cup of his wrath, how they will suffer. And Jesus says, give it to me. I will drink that cup. I will drink it to the dregs. Let me be the one who suffers. So this is what he says to them in verse 36 and following. He said to them, but now if you have a purse, take it, and also a bag, and if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one. It is written, and he was numbered with the transgressors. And I tell you that this must be fulfilled in me. Yes, what is written about me is reaching its fulfillment. Jesus says, I'm going to take the place of those who walk in darkness. And so the way he reveals his power is not by smiting his enemies, but by healing them. That's what he came to do. Not to crush those who dwell in darkness, but to give them light. To bear in himself the consequences of that darkness. And so it is that Jesus, though with one swipe of his paw, if you'll forgive the metaphor, could have just scattered them all. Could have made each one of them just drop dead on the spot. Instead, he heals his enemy and goes willingly to custody and to a cross, so as to give light to those in darkness, freedom to those held in slavery by the false power of evil, and life to those who are spiritually dead. And so, ironically, in this hour when darkness can do its worst, all it can achieve is to bring about the best. In killing Jesus, all the powers of evil achieve is what he wants them to achieve, which is setting free the people that he loves, freeing them from the very power of the darkness that closes in around him. It's astonishing, isn't it, that God chooses to achieve his victory through weakness, through submitting himself to the very worst that his enemies can do, and allowing them to exhaust all their power on him. Because you see, darkness has no real power. He has all power. And yet he chose to lay it down to give us life. So in a moment we will gather together around God's table and remember in bread and wine just what it is that Jesus was willing to do for us. And as we do so, let us marvel at his wisdom, at his power, but even more than any of that, at his astonishing love for people like us. And I think Guy is now going to come and lead us in prayer.